Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webcast. My name is Christine Dorsey Davis. I'm the Executive Director of the Ohio chapter of the American Planning Association, and I am your webcast moderator. Today is Friday, April 30th, and we will hear the presentation, Planning for Infrastructure Resilience, from Aging Infrastructure to Climate Change. For technical help during today's webcast, you can type your questions in the chat box found in your GoToWebinar tool panel, and I'll do my best to help you out. For your content questions related to the presentation, again, type those in the questions box located in your GoToWebinar tool panel. We will answer those at the end of the presentation during the Q&A. It would help me out if you would list who the question is for, which one of our panelists, just as I'm going through the list trying to get our questions. That would be very helpful, so thank you. Coming up next on your screen is a list of our sponsoring APA chapters and divisions for 2021. Thanks to all those participating sponsors for making these webcasts possible and free to members. And today, in particular, we are sponsored by the APA Hazard Mitigation and Disaster Recovery Planning Division. So thanks to you for hosting today. And Kelly, I know you're in the background there somewhere. Thanks for putting this together, and we have a great lineup of speakers today. Looking forward to it. Coming up on your screen is a list of our upcoming webcasts that we have. Head over to ohioplanning.org/planning webcasts. You can see we have some holds here. Just collecting the final bits of information. We're actually booked through the summer, through August, and we're starting to book September and October. So stay tuned. Just know that it's Fridays from 1 to 2:30, and I'll get these up and listed and ready for registration as soon as I can. ohioplanning.org/planning webcast is where you can go to get all that information and to register for those sessions. Today's session has been approved for 1.5 CM credits for live viewing. Head over to planning.org, log into your My APA account, and from there you can either search by today's title or event number, both of which can be found on our webcast webpage, so be sure to log those CM credits. And like us on Facebook, just search Planning Webcast Series and we'll pop up. That's where I post important, timely information like date or time changes, cancellations, when there's new sessions available for you to register. I'll post up on our Facebook page so that you know to head on over and register. And we record all of our sessions and we post them on our YouTube channel. Just search Planning Webcast and we'll pop up. And that's where we house all of our webcasts. We have over 300 of our previous webcasts available on our YouTube channel. So be sure to join us. We have a couple thousand subscribers. We'd love to have you join, and you'll get notified when a new session recording is available for you to view. Again, type your questions in the chat box as you think of them, and we'll get to those at the end during the Q&A. And with that, I am going to turn it over to Joe to kick things off. And Joe, those controls are yours.
Hopefully folks can see my screen, I believe.
Yes, sir.
Good stuff. All right, so I'll get started.
Just throw it in presentation mode.
Yep. Okay.
Perfect. Thanks.
All right. Thanks, Christine. Hi, folks. My name is Joe DeAngelis. I'm a research manager for the American Planning Association, and I'm a co-author of our relatively recent PAS report, PAS 596, Planning for Infrastructure Resilience. Today, I'm going to talk through some of the research that went into that report, some of our findings, especially as they concern community planners and their involvement in long-term infrastructure planning and where that intersects with climate adaptation and long-term resilience. So hopefully this information can help to set the stage for some of the more actionable on-the-ground perspective that the next two speakers will be providing. So first up, a little bit of context on where this project came from. So this work grew out of a NOAA-funded Regional Coastal Resilience Grant. This was a joint effort between APA and the Association of State Floodplain Managers. Through the project, we were really looking to understand the barriers to ensuring that infrastructure is resilient and adaptable to climate change, and how planners can help to mainstream this work at the local level. So we work with two different communities by offering some technical assistance and also using their experiences as case studies for other communities to refer to and look at. Two communities that we worked with were Toledo, Ohio, primarily, the metro area. So this was inclusive of the city of Toledo and Lucas County, and also the Savannah, Chatham County MPO, Georgia. The reason for this involving the county level was really to get a look at the infrastructure that tends to be planned and prioritized through a CIP, a capital improvements plan. A lot of that happens at the county level. So we wanted to make sure that we were making that connection through our research. The work really resulted in a pretty wide-ranging report, Planning for Infrastructure Resilience, which I just mentioned before, which is intended to take a holistic view of both infrastructure planning and planning for climate change. And it kind of identifies planners, local community planners, hopefully the people on this call, as the nexus for bringing this work together. So just a bit of basic info, the infrastructure sectors that you see here on the screen, those are the ones that we primarily ended up researching for this report. So this is biased towards public infrastructure, infrastructure that's planned, funded, and built by cities and counties at the local level, although it is inclusive of those quasi-municipal, privately run utilities and things like that. The graphic you see over on the right, that's from the most recent National Climate Assessment, and it's a really useful illustration of why we started this work. So their research, they found that while there's been movement since 2014, a lot of communities across the United States are just now moving from that infrastructure assessment phase more fully into the phase of actively planning for infrastructure that's climate resilient. And while there is movement towards that implementation piece, that movement is limited. So there's a lot of work to be done on developing guidance and building capacity to translate these needs assessments and plans into action. I'm not going to get too deeply into the science, but generally, over the coming decades, we can expect the risk of flooding and cascading impacts to communities across the US is going to worsen because of climate change. And sea level rise specifically is going to have an amplifying effect, not only on the impacts of named coastal storms, but also on those mundane, increasingly common threats of, sunny day tidal flooding in coastal communities. Communities that are, they're confronting these threats large and small, but they also have to grapple with longer term existential dangers of water that simply continues to rise year over year. And future climate risks for flooding especially, they're not just limited to communities that are threatened by sea level rise. Inland communities, they face uncertain futures as well. There are threats posed by extreme precipitation in the form of riverine flooding, disruptive stormwater flooding, and even that smaller scale nuisance flooding, the stuff that closes streets and fills basements and it wears down infrastructure over time. The graphics here, they both illustrate changes in the average amount of precipitation in the heaviest 1% of events by the end of the century. So we're not really just concerned with total changes in rainfall due to climate change, but more the precipitation that's coming as a result of more powerful events. So back in 2017, APA conducted a survey of our membership that was focused on generally assessing the temperature of planners' involvement in these two different areas. So on one hand, we wanted to see if planners or their departments were involved in local climate adaptation planning. But on the other hand, we wanted to see if planners were involved in CIP, capital improvements planning generally, specifically, or local infrastructure planning more generally. The reason for this was really trying to see where there was some sort of synthesis of these two things. If planners and other local practitioners were part of the effort to actually connect the two. So what did we find? Well, on the climate side, we found that planners' interest in climate adaptation and their work and their interest in using climate science was widespread, and this was encouraging, but the actual development of adaptation plans or specific plans to incorporate climate science and information into planning and then into implementation was lacking. So this was attributed to a variety of reasons, but maybe most importantly, the sense of local planners not necessarily being empowered to use the climate information that they have in their actual work. The decision was either not up to them, or the issue was too politically fraught, or maybe the science, and we saw this throughout our surveys, the science was not really seen as reliable or specific enough to use alongside of more familiar sources of information, especially information that concerns hazards. I don't want to generalize too much because, again, this isn't the experience of all planners, especially in larger communities, which we found through the survey as well. There might be more institutional support or local expertise or capacity or money to do some of this stuff. The involvement of planners in the infrastructure planning process was also lacking. So this was limited by a few things. Lots of communities don't have a formal capital improvements plan. If there was one, the involvement of the planning department was generally limited. So in some communities, they led the process for sure, but in others, they served on a more advisory or procedural role, and things were managed out of public works or some other department. And before I forget, the actual links between the CIP and the local comp plan, these were highlighted by a bunch of our respondents as existing, really only in theory and never actually in practice. To get a bit beyond the doom and gloom that I've been describing, we did hear about a lot of the great work that communities are doing in adaptation generally, and then linking it to their CIP. So some of the respondents to the survey, they outlined a more ad hoc approach that's based around specific local sectors. For example, I'm thinking now the management of environmental resources, or the siting and design of public buildings. Other communities seem to have gone with a more comprehensive approach, one that looked to tie in formal climate adaptation plans with specific action items that are related to infrastructure planning in a general sense, or process improvements that are related to the capital improvements plan. So incorporating sea level rise data into the process of prioritizing an infrastructure project. That's something that we saw a couple times. These findings, they kind of help to serve as a bridge to a series of interviews that we conducted with some of our respondents and the folks they recommended. So as a result of these fairly in-depth interviews that we had, we tried to nail down a few factors that influenced how these communities were approaching the use of climate information and extreme weather risk in their infrastructure planning work. So things like community size, local capacity and expertise, the availability of local funding, or not just the availability of local funding, but the actual capacity to seek out local funding. Support from the state, which is really critical, we found, or in absence of support from the state, support from regional organizations, access to specific local data and information, or familiarity with data and information from other sources like NOAA's Climate Resilience Toolkit, FEMA data resources, things like that. But these interviews were also a really good way for us to kind of hammer down some of the issues and barriers that communities might run into. So onto those barriers, and we really labeled them as 4 big disconnects that we see as preventing more comprehensive attempts to realize more resilient infrastructure. So the first one is, the work of community planning doesn't always overlap with the work of infrastructure and capital planning. So planning departments might not necessarily be a part of a CIP process, or they might be a part of that process, but that involvement might end, we saw this a few times, with the planning director, and not tie in the other planning staff who are helping to update a comp plan or are knowledgeable about some specific neighborhood where there might be a planned piece of infrastructure. Next, climate adaptation planning might not have any explicit connection with infrastructure planning. So it might deal in generalities about the need for resilient infrastructure, or it might identify areas of high risk due to flooding from increased precipitation, but the identification of some vulnerability in some specific area might not go anywhere other than identifying that vulnerability. So, referencing that graphic earlier of communities investing heavily on the awareness and assessment side and less so in the planning and implementation end. And that leads right into the next item. There might just be a tenuous connection with climate adaptation planning and then the process of prioritizing, scoping, designing, building the infrastructure projects in a community. What role does the adaptation plan have in modifying an established CIP process? What role does it have in requiring project managers to account for sea level rise or coastal hazards or extreme precipitation? What role does that adaptation plan have in reprioritizing projects based on the identification of areas of high risk? These might sound like procedural things, but those procedural things, they constitute the bulk of the work. It's not just the plans themselves, but how we're changing processes to build adaptation directly into a prioritization, scoping, design process. Finally, the last big disconnect that I'm mentioning here is the disconnect between the availability of climate science and its use in planning. So planners might not have the expertise to use climate science in their work in its raw form. They might be overwhelmed with the resources that are available. They might not be empowered by their planning director or their city manager or city council. that information might not be trusted in the same way more well-established sources of hazards information are. Or finally, the uncertainty associated with climate change. Basically, the variability of projections for, say, precipitation over a period of time, say 15 or 20 years, that's based on different probabilities for different high and low greenhouse gas emission scenarios. So that might just feel too daunting, and we found this in our interviews and in our survey. It might feel too daunting, and it never is finding its way into the actual plans and the implementation side. So expanding on this topic of uncertainty in the context of infrastructure planning and some of what's unique to the circumstances of building things that are expected to last for a long time. First, a piece of infrastructure or a public building, it's expected to last for decades, and often it's in service for a lot longer than it's actually designed for. So it's designed for, a 50-year period, and it's probably going to last, or is expected to last for 75 years, 80 years. Second, this stuff is expensive. But climate models and climate projections, they're not perfect. So they don't tell us, for example, how much sea level rise we might see over a defined period of time. They give us a range based on a series of scenarios that are either more or less probable, but they're not a sure thing. But the time frame for what we expect to see significant climate impacts and a time frame that we expect infrastructure to be around for, those two things line up really closely. So communities are faced with paying a lot of money to build things, but they're also facing the difficult decision about whether they'll include climate considerations, what kind of future scenarios they're going to be building for, high, medium, low scenarios. And you're asking them to make a long-term decision under a fairly significant amount of uncertainty and outcomes. So that really brings us to what then is the role of community planning and infrastructure resilience. So while thinking about planning in this context, planning has a long range perspective, one that lines up really well with the life cycle of infrastructure and the worsening of climate change impacts. So you're roughly 15, 25-year time frame and beyond. Planning is intended to approach problems comprehensively. It says that everything is related to everything else. So for example, a zoning code that's isolated from a long-range transportation plan isn't really helping anyone. And if both of those items aren't considering the question of the increased risk of future flooding in an area susceptible to it, well, then there's going to be problems with both the zoning code and the long-range transportation plan. So planning ideally can help to account for these complex interactions between different variables. And planning deals in unique place-based issues. So whether the issues are things like noticeably worsening high tides in a certain geography or aging infrastructure in an area that's already home to vulnerable populations, good long-term planning would hopefully be considering those realities on the ground in future plans and ongoing implementation actions. Ultimately, and finally, this brings us to PAS 596, Planning for Infrastructure Resilience. This report, I've covered a lot of the groundwork that's gone into this report. The report is targeted at both planners and floodplain managers, but it really provides guidance in 4 major areas. So explicit guidance on the state of climate science with regard to infrastructure. So we rely heavily on the most recent National Climate Assessment for this. The importance of assessing vulnerability across the community to inform future plans and implementation, the utility of different types of plans informing a body of work that can be consulted in the implementation process. So plans serving as authoritative sources of information that can be used when infrastructure is being cited and designed. And finally, the CIP process itself. So prioritizing projects and putting shovels in the ground based on funding that's been made available. The truth is there is a lot in this report. In the interest of time, I'm only going to be skimming the bottom 3 of these here. Assessing vulnerability, creating plans, and implementation. So in the report, we define vulnerability assessment as a distinct stage, but in a lot of communities, assessing vulnerability to climate hazards, it's part of that pre-plan making visioning process itself, that gathering of existing conditions type work. But vulnerability assessment can also be, or is understood, especially with infrastructure, as a smaller scale assessment in the context of a single piece of infrastructure, a single public building or something like that. For our purposes, since the guidance is targeted at community planners, our concern in this report is whole community infrastructure resilience, bringing a holistic view to this. So establishing vulnerability on a broad scale, and then using that as your jumping off point for all of the other work that you're going to be doing. So this work can comprise, defining baseline conditions of infrastructure, establishing future flood risks to both infrastructure specifically and the community generally, outlining those long-term community needs for new infrastructure, and then ultimately developing plans from that baseline understanding of risk. In a lot of places, planners are already major parts of this work, but we think it's important to kind of standardize and establish this as critical to building that local culture of infrastructure resilience. We then turn to plans and the plan making process itself. So in the report, we advocate for a highly integrated approach. And by that, all of the plan types here address local infrastructure in some way. And they're all at least likely to lead to, incorporate, some sort of addressing of natural hazard risks within a specific planning sector. These plans we propose are an ideal opportunity for planners and other folks who are working in a planning capacity to bring these two areas together with an eye toward long-term community-wide risk and future infrastructure needs. So essentially, we call for considering infrastructure needs and future climate context at all stages of the planning process. So from that early public outreach and visioning through the plan drafting process, the conclusion of the plan, and any follow-up work that needs to be done within each subsection of the plan as well. So for example, in a comp plan, there's lots of different plan elements, things like economic development, community facilities, public health, recreation. I won't go into all of them, zoning and land use. Each of these sections we think is an opportunity for either thinking about the direct and indirect links with local infrastructure needs, but also the direct and indirect links to future climate impacts. So to enable that implementation end of it, connecting from that, communities really should be clear about the agencies and departments that are leading their implementation efforts and the timeframes for the expected completion of these efforts. So even when not leading implementation efforts, we think that planners should have major roles on teams and committees and work groups that are tasked with actually implementing the work, especially as it concerns infrastructure that is resulting from a comp plan. Those planners, they carry forward that institutional knowledge of the plan, which hopefully will have built in that climate information, and that can play a really important role in advancing the consideration of climate information in project-specific planning or siting or design. Finally, and this is actually my last slide here, as we discussed earlier, the CIP itself can either be a highly regimented and established process, or it can be decentralized across city agencies. It might be less defined and more loosely connected meetings where local priorities are discussed and established. We think that local planners and plans should play a major role in all of these situations, especially with regard to integrating those future climate and hazard risks into specific infrastructure projects and programs. So I'm not going to read all this, and I do apologize for including a large text graphic in the presentation, but this is kind of a summary of the ways in which planners and long-term plans can productively facilitate conversation across city agencies, advocate for the use of vulnerability assessments and existing conditions assessments into the local CIP prioritization process, and really work to link the guidance in a climate adaptation plan or a hazard mitigation plan or a comp plan with that pre-implementation on the ground work that might be happening as part of a CIP. With that, hopefully I've set the stage a bit for the two speakers to come. If you want to read the PAS report, I would leave a link, but honestly, you could just Google PAS 596 and the first result is the one that you're looking for. Thanks, and I'm looking forward to the questions at the end of the presentations. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now and transfer it over to Rhonda.
And while Rhonda's teeing that up, I am going to provide a link to the PAS report in the chat box for everyone if you would like to download it.
Okay, can you all see my screen?
Yes, ma'am.
All right. So Joe, wow, that was fascinating. And hopefully you're going to hear in my presentation how we're following almost all of those guidelines that he said. So I'm Rhonda Haag. I'm the Chief Resilience Officer for the Monroe County. And for those of you that don't know where that is, that's in the fabulous Florida Keys. We stretch from Key Largo to Key West. And you're going to hear today, and you can see in this very picture, why we are so vulnerable in the Florida Keys. So since we have a planner's audience today, we're going to talk a little bit about how we're vulnerable and what we're doing in the Keys to be more resilient, but we're also going to talk about how planners have been involved every step of the way. So we're going to talk about the location of the project. I'm going to talk about our roadway elevation study that's underway. As an island community, you can imagine that we're very vulnerable to sea level rise because we are at or near sea level. Going to talk a little bit about our resiliency and climate program and how the planners were involved every step of the way and how they're still involved. Our local infrastructure adaptation in terms of road elevations and how the planners were definitely involved in that and still are. And well, there I say, and the role of planners. So, you know, we can't afford not to have planners involved in our infrastructure projects because we're talking about spending billions of dollars, as you'll hear as I proceed. So the location, as I said, is in the Florida Keys, and that's the southern tip of Florida. It stretches from Key Largo to Key West. And our roadway vulnerability study goals are to, of course, help make our island chain more resilient because most of our islands are at or near sea level. The rising seas, even over the past 100 years with 9 or 10 inches, we're already seeing water on many of the neighborhood roads during the fall king tide season. So we have to be able to plan ahead and be able to elevate our roads in order to meet these needs. And if we don't, residents are not going to be able to get access to their homes. We'll see in a little bit how a few neighborhoods are already limited access during the fall king tide season. You know, they're definitely after the county to help elevate those roads and sooner rather than later. And of course, it's to help maintain property values. So if we can't help residents maintain access to their homes, they're not going to want to stay here. And then, you know, that's going to definitely affect property values. And once property values start dropping because of a local government isn't helping to be resilient, it's hard to turn around. So that's why we've been doing this a decade already. And here is just some of the things what we're looking at. So we look at the island chain and then we highlight all of the local roads. So we're not looking at highways. There's only one highway in the Keys anyway. It's going one highway in and out, that's US 1, but the rest are all locally maintained roads that the county maintains. And so this is what this study is about, the road elevation. It's what's the county going to do for our local roads. And so what's the urgency? Well, looky here. This is the New York Times. So we're really popular with the national and international media. This is a neighborhood in Key Largo. 82 days they were underwater for some level, sometimes up to 1.5 feet, maybe a little bit more. So of course the residents aren't happy. We're trying to do our best to catch up, but you know, we've got a lot of attention. You know, we speak all over the world for international media too, because we're kind of like the canary in the coal mine. Everybody wants to see what's going on here. And here's some neighborhood flooding. Key Largo is in the northern part of the county. Stillwright Point was underwater for 85 days. They see pretty well this kind of routine flooding every October, November now for the last 4 or 5 years. It didn't used to be this bad, but of course with the rising seas, this is what we're seeing now. Here's Twin Lakes. This is actually, it gets much worse than this one. And then Big Pine in the lower Keys. And this is, you know, a key deer walking along a road. It's not a canal. And so Monroe County, being an island community stretching along through the Atlantic Ocean, we're one of the most vulnerable counties in the nation. In fact, we're rated 3rd in that if the land that's now dry will go underwater by 2060, and 36% of our population, I think it's actually more now, could be displaced if we do nothing to help prepare. And here's what some of our, our roads look like during the fall king tides. This was back in 2015 was really when we started to see the big increase. Like I said, for the last decade or so, we had neighborhoods with maybe a couple of inches of water on the roads, but 2015 was really like the banner year when we started seeing over 1 foot of water on some of these neighborhood roads. And then it's rather continued. So here's 2019. Again, this is the Stillwright Point neighborhood. It's a road, not a canal. Here we are again, again, these are roads. And so, you know, this is salt water on the road. It's not fresh water. And so, you know, it's kind of like a double whammy. The residents not only have to drive through deep water, and it scares them because we have a lot of elderly residents, but it's also salt water. So it's, you know, hard on their vehicles. But, you know, when we get these king tides, especially when they're this deep, it's also limiting public services, like our postal service won't go down there. Our sheriff won't do the routine patrols. I mean, they'll go out there on an emergency, but for routine patrols, they choose not to do that. So you can see how residents' lives are affected when they have these fall tidal waters on the roads. And so what have we done? So we've known for quite a while, you know, we're vulnerable, but before you can, you know, start doing these big infrastructure planning projects, you have to do your data gap analysis. So back in we started it in 2014, we started our sea level rise planning, where we prepared a Green Keys Sustainability and Climate Action Plan. And that we did all that vulnerability analysis that you heard Joe talk about, so we could understand where we were most vulnerable. So being an island community, we thought we were most vulnerable in a lot of different areas, but as it turned out, it was the roads. And anyway, so in this 5-year plan, there's 165 recommendations. I'm a big projects person, so I had our consultant help us put it down into 5-year increments with these projects broken down. And when we did that 5-year work plan, we included every single department in the county. It wasn't Rhonda Haag putting together this plan. It was the planning department, it was the roads department, public works, the county administrator, everybody, because we all have a piece in planning in Monroe County for the keys when we start talking about resilience. So it's definitely an integrated approach. Now, it didn't used to be that way, of course, before we started working on things like this, because we all tend to work in our silos. But because we are so vulnerable and have so much planning and so much infrastructure work to do in the future, we have to work together. And some of these recommendations included, we're going to have to amend our comp plan to deal with policy issues related to these infrastructure. What if we can't afford to elevate all the roads? What are we going to do? Are we going to abandon them? Are we going to just maintain them in their current state as they continue to go underwater? So those are some of the types of things we're talking about for our comprehensive plan. And we also put a couple of pilot road elevation projects in there. You saw the former slides where those neighborhoods were underwater. Well, our commissioners said, hey, let's do a couple of pilot road projects and let's test and see how expensive it's going to be. Let's see what methods are going to work here, because we haven't elevated our roads before. So it's new to us. We had to improve our elevation data. We had the aerial flown LiDAR data. Well, that can be off by up to 6 inches. So we had to do mobile LiDAR so we could be ensured of accuracy. And that's only off maybe by at the most a ½ inch at the very most. And then finally, this engineering analysis. So when we have all this climate planning information in our sea level rise projections, you now have to work with engineering, put the two of those together to figure out how to do your resilience planning. And as I said, we added an energy and climate element to our comprehensive plan because energy and climate are so important to our county. So we added a whole special chapter on just that. Then I talked about our pilot road elevation. Those are now just wrapping up their design and we're ready to be constructing them. And then I talked about the LiDAR elevation. We spent $500,000 doing mobile LiDAR, where the little van drove up and down every single mile of our 300 miles of roads and brought us this new elevation data. And then finally, because you're going to hear how expensive this all is, we work really hard to look for as many grants as we can to help us not only do the planning, because we're kind of wrapping up on the planning now in the next year or so. We're going to be looking forward now to big infrastructure grants to help us pay for it. So what's in process right now? So we have the roads, I call it the roads adaptation plan. It's really how to identify what are going to be the impacts to the roads, how much water is going to be on these roads in the next 25 years. So we're looking up to the year 2045, because that's about how long we're expecting a road to last. And hopefully, like Joe said, it'll last longer. So we're going to look at how much water is anticipated to be on the roads. And we're going to look at, you know, when those roads need to be elevated and how high. But when you're doing all that analysis, you have to figure out how you're going to rank the roads. We have more than 300 miles of roads. So we can't elevate them all, nor do we want to, because that would cost many billions of dollars. So we have to figure out how to rank them. And that's where the planners are really helpful. And then identify our policy options. Like I said, if we can't afford to elevate them, or perhaps it doesn't make sense to elevate some where only a few people live, and maybe we don't want to spend tens or hundreds of millions of dollars, we're going to have to determine what to do. And then finally, our alternatives. What's a road elevation going to look like? So we have very different environments in the Keys. And so a road elevation in the woods in Big Pine Key, where it's, you know, very skinny roads and very rural, might look different from a road adaptation or elevation project in Key Largo, which tends to be more suburban and have wider roads. So we're designing now several different alternatives to what those are going to look like. The vulnerability assessment, so we already know how vulnerable our roads are. We did that. So we've just actually now just completing a vulnerability assessment for everything else. We pipe our water in from Dade County. We don't even have any of our own drinking water. So we had to look at that. We had to look at all of our county infrastructure, our buildings. We actually have 3 different sets of county facilities, one in Key Largo, one in Marathon, a big set, and then in Key West. We have all those buildings all over the place in the parks. We had to look at everything to see where we're going to be vulnerable so that we could plan. And then also there's the habitat. We have to look for the habitat and animals to see how we can help them. And then finally, we're in the middle of a comprehensive plan update. And the planners, of course, are doing this. We're looking at peril of flood amendments, adaptation action areas. If you're in Ohio, you may not know what that is, but that's a special designation in Florida that was set up. It's where a local government, if they want to, they can set aside certain areas, whether it's habitat areas or neighborhoods, where they're looking at the futures, how these areas are going to be affected by future sea level rise, and we can set them aside and call them adaptation action areas. And then we can focus our resources and funding on helping those areas get through the future sea level rise, and then any other amendments as needed. So why are we doing this vulnerability study? Well, this graphic here shows you from the year 2020 to 2045, we are looking at 13 inches. And we've already had 10 inches over the last 100 years, but now the rate of increase of sea level rise is dramatically bigger. It's almost exponential. So we had, you know, 12 inches, 10 inches over the last 100 years. Now we're looking at 13 inches just in the next, you know, up to year 2045. Then another 11 beyond that, and then another 43. So that's a total of almost, just give me a second here, 5 feet of water by the year 2100. So, you know, we're not planning for that 2100. We're hoping, you know, that the projections are, that there's enough done in the world will reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, and hopefully that can be reduced, but we are definitely planning for 2045, and we're peaking at 2060 so that we can see what we might have to do there. Okay, so my screen has froze up. Okay, yep, there we go, almost 6 feet, I guess, in 80 years. So here's what a neighborhood, this is a Key Largo neighborhood, this is what it could look like by the year 2035, which is only, of course, 15 years away. We're looking at potentially 2 feet of water on their roads in front of their homes. So even if you have an elevated home, it's not necessarily going to be enough, because if you can't get to your elevated home, what good is it going to do you? And then now in 2045, just 10 years later, we're looking up to 2.5 feet of water on the roads. And then 2060, up to 3.5 feet. So you can see the effects of the incoming seas, because these are all very close to either Florida Bay or the Atlantic Ocean. And so the water's going to come right in. We're not miles and miles wide. You know, where islands are only a half a mile or a mile wide, or maybe 2 miles, 2 or 3 in the lower case. So you can see we have our kind of our work cut out for us. So what we did was we had the study underway, and we've come up with, and we did all the analysis. We took the climate projections, we crunched the numbers with our engineering analysis, and we determined. So in the next 20 years, 25, by the year 2045, half of our roads, half, are going to be vulnerable to sea level rise. They're going to have water on in some form or manner. And that's not just half of our roads, but 71% of our population live on those half of the roads. So we have a lot of populated areas that are in low-lying areas. And so you were looking at a lot of elevated roads that are going to be needed. By 2060, that number jumps from half to 66% and 82% of our population. Then by 2100, it's now 81% and 92%. So like I said, we're looking at just the year 2045, and out of 300 miles, half are going to be. Now, to get us through the year 2045, we did the analysis. It's going to cost $1.8 billion, plus or minus. So we're a community of 75,000 people. So that's going to be, you know, that's a big bite to pay for $1.8 billion. So we're going to have to look at ways to pay for this. And maybe we can't afford all of it. And that's where those planners are going to have to come in and help us with policies if we can't find the money to pay for all of that. Okay, so here's where the planners really helped us. They helped us determine our road ranking criteria. So I won't get a lot into the technical, but I do want you to see how the planners helped us. So first we had to determine how the roads were vulnerable to sea level rise. And then second, we had to determine criticality, and that's really the human factor. So vulnerability is environment, criticality is the human factor, because you don't want to elevate all your roads just based on how vulnerable they are to sea level rise, because if there's not a lot of people that live on those roads, you're spending a lot of money and not getting a lot of bang for your buck. So you really have to have these two factors together. And this is kind of what vulnerability includes. Your groundwater clearance, you know, as our water sea level rise continue to rise, we don't have any groundwater clearance left. You're going to see more and more. Number 2, surface inundation. You're going to see more and more waters on the road. 3 is storm surge, surface wave impact. You know, we live in an ocean, and when, you know, the seas continue to rise, those surface waves becomes higher and stronger. And then you have to look at your existing pavement. So if your roads are underwater for long periods of time, you're going to have your pavement start to disintegrate. And so this just kind of shows you an example in Lower Keys of what a road can look like. So by the year 2025, which is 5 years from now, sea level rise is there's going to be water along the very edges of the shoulder. If you see that left red line on the left, that kind of shows you where sea level rise. And then the king tides during the fall, they're going to see water right up to the sides of their roads for 2-3 months of the year. That's in 5 years from now. Now let's look at 2045. Now we got sea level rise, the red marks coming up to the side of the road year round. And then in the fall king tide season, now we're looking at a 1/2 foot of water across the road for 2 months straight, maybe 3, depending on conditions. And now look at 2060, looking at almost 1.5 foot of water across the road during the fall king tides, and, you know, 1/3 across during the sea level rise all year round. So this is not going to be acceptable to the residents. So that's why we're planning so far ahead. And then the step 2, the criticality assessment, that's the people thing that assesses how many people are there. So we're going to take that score we got from the first one and then add in like the number of people that are living on the road, whether there's any hospitals or fire station or other critical infrastructure. We're going to look at commercial buildings, and then we're going to include the threatened and endangered focus and endangered species look, and any wetlands or natural habitats. And then roadway, the functional, whether it's a, you know, we're not doing highway, so we're looking at whether it's a major road or a local road. And so what you do then, you know, the planners, this is really where they help, because they're the experts in all this. You know, I'm not, neither is our public works department. So we really relied on the planners to help determine what these scores should be, not only the categories, but what the weight should be. So they thought, you know, roadway surface is important because that's the water depth, but so are all these other things: groundwater clearance, inundation, surface wave. And so that's the vulnerability factor. And then we take that score we get from there and take it to step 2, which is the people factor, the criticality. We take that vulnerability score, add in the number of people living there, whether there's critical infrastructure, wetlands, and everything else. And then when you get all of this done, you have a score, and that's how we ranked our 300 miles of roads in terms of need for elevation. So I want to thank the planners for that. So I'm not going to get into a lot of this. I just want to show you how the planners were definitely involved in the input for planning, definitely involved in the presentations to the public in our commission meetings, and working with our engineering department on ensuring, you know, that whatever's going into this, you know, the engineering was also involved. And then finally in implementation, when we get to that, we're going to have to, that's where we determine the policies. Now, once we know how much it costs and what sample design elevations look like, you know, we might not have room to elevate our roads. When you make them higher, you have to make them wider. And we have a lot of roads that are very skinny as it is. And if we have to elevate them 1 foot or 1.5 feet or 2 feet, we're not going to be able to make them wider. So then we're going to have to make some tough decisions about what to do with that. So we have a lot of really, really interesting policy decisions and work in the next year. Okay, and so this is just aligning our comprehensive plan to everything we're doing. You heard me talk about the climate and energy element, our peril of flood, our overall integration of sea level rise into all of our other comprehensive plan elements. We're actually doing all of these updates right now. We're kind of wrapping them up here in the next 2 or 3 months. And our stormwater policy, let me tell you, when you're looking at elevating 150 miles of roads, that's a lot more stormwater now, because now we have to add in drainage. We have to collect the water and transport it and treat it. We now have to have big pump stations. So right now in the Keys, we don't have any treatment. It's really just blacktop or gravel roads on rock. And now when we have to elevate, of course, we have to meet the new guidelines, and we're going to have to add pump stations and stormwater collection and treatment. So that's where the comprehensive plan is really going to help us. And here's what we're going to do in the future: integration of our road study into capital improvements planning process. We got that $2 billion to spend. We have to make sure we spend it correctly. those adaptation action areas I talked about, where they're going to be in neighborhoods that we're going to set aside, that we're going to say these are more vulnerable in the future. So we want to focus our dollars on there. We're going to have to look at our shorelines. We're going to have more shoreline actually as the seas continue to rise. We're going to actually have more shoreline, so we have to deal with that. Our remaining growth in the Keys. We're a growth limited county. We're very growth limited, and so we have to look at that. Our development rights, and finally our infrastructure commitments and our land acquisition. We buy a lot of vacant lots down here because we do have limited growth. So we have to control all of this and still build in our resilience and maintain access. And then of course, disaster recovery. So our planning decisions form the framework for our adaptation approaches. We have to look at our future growth. Where's the growth going to be? Should we be elevating roads if they're in areas where there's not a lot of people or where there's no permits left to do future growth? We have to look at that. We're going to need to get our biggest bang for our buck. And this level of service, are we going to be able to elevate roads everywhere? Or are some neighborhoods going to get higher roads? Are they going to be able to withstand higher levels of sea level than others? We might have to make these kind of decisions. And about, you might see in some of your northern areas where they have, travel at your own risk. We might have to have some of those type of roads, travel at your own risk during the fall king tides. And finally, maintenance. And what are our obligations to maintain these roads? Are we obligated to elevate them? So we're doing all of these studies right now to look at that. And then finally, our implementation strategies is our comp plan. So what we're looking at countywide, we're doing our part on the county. We're looking at all of our vulnerability and planning for our roads, especially our roads, but all the rest too. But private property, they're going to have to do their part, because just because we raise a road doesn't mean that the backyards or empty lots aren't going to get filled in with seas with the rising water. So we have to look, are we going to allow residents to fill in their yards? We're in a national marine sanctuary. We're very, very protected and have a lot of federal laws here. And right now our policies don't necessarily allow everybody to fill in their yards. They're not allowed to put seawalls everywhere because I said it's a very sensitive marine environment. So we're going to have to look at whether we're going to allow our policies to change so that private property can be prepared. And so then working together, you can see only by working together with government and private property will we have a resilient Florida Keys. And so this kind of shows you how we're implementing. We're looking at our public road elevation and flood mitigation and all of these different areas, comprehensive plan and LDRs. And then we're looking at private property. How are we going to allow shorelines? Are we going to allow this, fill in the yards? Are we going to allow shoreline hardening? And then number 3, are we looking at public and private availability? Are we going to need to buy lots to put, to make it more resilient in certain areas? Or where are we going to put our big stormwater pumps? Things like that. So a lot of planning decisions coming. It's going to be a very fascinating 5 years coming up here in Monroe County. And that completes my presentation. So thank you. And I need to change presenter to Mark.
So let me know if you see my PowerPoint.
We sure do.
Oh, wow. Okay, great. Let me get in.
Perfect.
Okay, thank you. I hope to build on what Joe and Rhonda just presented. Very quickly, I am Mark Reiner. 2 weeks ago, I had a company called WISRD, Whole Infrastructure Systems for Resilient Development. It is now a platform at Jacobs, and I'm Director of Resilient Infrastructure at Jacobs. So excuse the wonky branding, but things are moving right now. I want to build on what Joe used the word empowered. Stakeholders need to be empowered. And for me, that means that you need a well-founded perspective of infrastructure in your own language and own metrics that are meaningful. So this presentation will have a couple slides on WISRD, but really is about the background for developing a unique planning perspective for infrastructure by looking at the characterizing the expressions of aging infrastructure for urban resilience. So aging infrastructure is indeed very relevant today. The question is, who's taking the lead on this discussion? As an engineer, I know that we focus on new projects, new assets. Utility engineers, they will focus on a single sector, transportation or water, whatever it might be. And they don't necessarily look at age, they look at the remaining useful life that I'll touch on briefly. It really is the urban planner, urban resiliency planner that has to deal with a full legacy of all aging infrastructure in the city. The step, though, to move towards characterizing it is, how do we talk about it? How do we talk about urban infrastructure and resilience planning? So to start that discussion, allow me to use a kind of dictionary definition that a resilient system is one that can absorb a shock or recover quickly and resume its intended function. And I want to start with that because the real question is, what system are we talking about? You can't just talk about one system at a time when a city is a system of systems. So you really have to focus on what is the interdependence of infrastructure across all systems. And a little bit of background to address this, or partially address this. A few years ago, I wrote a paper called Foundational Infrastructure Framework with a colleague of mine at WISRD, where these gray slabs represent the foundational building blocks of a city. They're the key infrastructure sectors. They themselves are dependent on natural resources that come in through our supply and transmission infrastructure into the city. But within the city, you would classify these sectors basically as horizontal infrastructure and distributive, meaning they connect up to every residential meter and business meter. And I would just throw buildings in the vertical infrastructure category. And then as a city and private entities develop the essential services from fire and law, emergency, food supply and distribution, and banking, and people can take out mortgages for houses and kids to school. And if the city has a great economy and governance, these are the societal services that really distinguish one city from another in terms of vitality and viability. But to make a point here, let me just use building a house as a metaphor to building a city. That with a house, you start with a foundation. You build the physical structure of the house, and if it's aesthetically pleasing and everything works, people move in and make it a home. And the point of that is the interdependency, that it's not a hierarchy. In no way is a foundation more important than the people moving into the city or the house. The point is that people won't move into your house or your city if everything is crumbling. So if there's some logic that you can accept with that, consider how we treat our distributive infrastructure. That the pipes and cables are buried in a soil, then we cover it with a soft asphalt, and then we commence to build our socioeconomic engines on top of that because everything is out of sight, out of mind. But every time something goes wrong with any one of those sectors, a lane is closed, a road is closed, a sidewalk is closed, and out comes a construction crew and cut it open to repair it. It's like when you're driving a car, if something goes wrong, you have to pull over, pop open the hood, and repair or replace something. So what's really the point on this one is the perspective. So if you're looking at a car, you wouldn't describe it as saying, I see a windshield, a hood, tires, side view mirrors, whatever. You'd say, I see a car. And what urban planners, urban resiliency planners really need is this 3D perspective of our urban roads, that they need to see this as a complete horizontal distributive infrastructure paradigm that is all uniquely tied together. Because it's that paradigm that is the source of chronic threats in the urban environment. That the inaccessibility of our infrastructure has led to deferred maintenance, which has by default led to aging infrastructure. And because it's out of sight, out of mind, we're just inured by what we see every day in our streets. That we spend $10 billion annually on spray paint and the labor to spray paint our roads. So the urban hieroglyphics is what I call them, that freshly paved roads will within days be covered with spray paint to identify where the underlying infrastructure is. We have standards for different levels of quality for discussing where it is located because we can't see it below our roads. And we even have physicists and civil engineers developing new quantum technology instruments to better locate where the buried infrastructure is. So this gets into, I know I'm an engineer, probably out of my lane talking about communication and language, but here we go. The key word for me starts with disruption, and it has been defined solely by the loss of service to end users. which is fine. So if you are in a storm and you lose your power for an hour, that is certainly a disruption. I'm suggesting we expand the use to describe the physical disruptions we see in the horizontal distributive infrastructure paradigm. You can see the sign is not saying it's because of a pothole or a water main or a gas main. It's describing the whole paradigm. The road is closed because something in it has gone wrong. How often does this happen? In New York City, the roads are cut open 550 times per day, again, for any reason. Because we have to use a soft asphalt in most cases because we want to cut it to get below. We have potholes. Toronto patches over 20,000 potholes in just the month of January. And anytime you have this a work zone, accidents increase by 20 to 70%. So now you're getting into what is a hazard? And oftentimes hazards involve money. And if you're in an accident, that's money out of your pocket. If you ding the rim of your tires because you go through a pothole, that's money out of your pocket. So this brings in what is the true cost of infrastructure? And to make it a simple summation, it's basically the direct costs that the utility pays for the asset, placing the asset, maintaining the asset, repairing, replacing the asset, all the labor, which sounds like it's almost all of it. But anytime there's any failed or accidentally damaged infrastructure, there are associated indirect costs that is borne by the public and individual residences and businesses. And these categories include property damage, traffic delays, environmental impacts, lawsuits, injuries, fatalities, etc. So the question is it significant to be considering in resiliency reporting? And in fact, accidental damage to buried infrastructure, it's been estimated indirect costs are 29 times that of direct costs. In 2019 alone, indirect costs of damaged buried utilities in the US was $30 billion. New York City alone is $300 million per year, again, across multiple sectors of infrastructure. So indirect costs is a straightforward methodology. The question is, why isn't it being used? And 3 reasons that I could see. Nobody has responsibility for determining the indirect costs due to failed or damaged infrastructure. Utilities use indemnification or no notice to avoid paying it. They certainly know it because they get lawsuits all the time that indemnification protects them from, but they also have the perspective. If you're a single sector, if you're the water utility, why do you care if the gas main caused indirect damage? They've done this. 2 decades ago, they created a spreadsheet called Grand Central Model. But at the end of the day, the engineers were like, why do we have to do this? Because look at number 1, we're not responsible for it. So for me, the planners really have to come in here is where in the city are disruptions actually hazards and where do we really care about indirect costs? And urban planners, as I mentioned, already deal with the legacy of aging infrastructure, but they need their own language and methodology. This is empowerment to characterize when disruptions become hazards that impact urban resilience. And as an example, it's a great report on resilience from Boston 2 years ago. And right up at the introductory letter, Mayor Marty Walsh, now Secretary Martin Walsh, said the right thing. It's addressing the most serious shocks, such as extreme weather events, and our chronic stresses, such as economic inequality and aging infrastructure. I was excited to read it, but then you read it, and aging infrastructure is mentioned one other time at the bottom of page 128, where it tells you you have a 311 number where you can call and complain about aging infrastructure. Granted, they talk about aging transit. They'll talk about a little bit about aging water, but not as a comprehensive plan or methodology for discussing aging infrastructure. So why is that? And it boils down to language. And this is perspective. And I did use the term empowering the city stakeholder. For me, that represents the urban planner who needs to communicate to the decision makers and the public. But using this water main from bell to bell as a timeline, where on the left, it's the date it's installed, on the right, it's the date it's repaired or replaced. You have to understand where you're getting your information when you do an inventory assessment, that if you're getting your information from a single sector utility that uses asset management, their perspective is not how old that pipe is, but how much remaining useful life we can get out of it. because they have their own direct costs and they're single sector focus, and there's no replacement for that. It's great. But you just have to understand the perspective that that pipe could be 110 years old, but if their condition assessment says we can get 20 more years out of it, it's not going to be in their next capital improvement plan. So you can't just say, oh, we're taking their information. We need a different perspective, not a different one, a complementary perspective to empower a discussion. How do you have a discussion if you only have one perspective? It's not a discussion. So a city's perspective needs to be multi-sector and consider additional vulnerabilities that I'll talk about next, but also the indirect costs, because you're trying to protect your residents and businesses. So what is the service life of all these assets? If a pipe is intended to be 80 years old as a service life, but it's 110, who's putting up the red flag? That's where the city perspective has to come in. So as an example, how we're not communicating. If you don't have the language, you are not communicating between people, the public, planners, and engineers. As an example, this ruler represents a key water utility key performance indicator, where if your utility system has 15 breaks or fewer per 100 miles of pipe of your transmission and distribution system per year, your best practice. If you have fewer breaks, you're great. If you have more breaks, you need to recheck your system and you're on the road to crisis. I want to bring up just language that came out of the last month's ASC report card, just 2 sentences. Our nation's drinking water system is made up of 2.2 million miles of underground pipes that deliver safe, reliable water to millions of people. There's a water main break every 2 minutes. So I would imagine I'm talking to planners that you might have the same perspective where this seems contradictory. Safe and reliable water main break every 2 minutes. But from the perspective of the utility, this works. You can have a water main break and still have reliable, safe water because of redundancy in the system. But I want you to look at it from the city perspective. A water main break every 2 minutes is 720 breaks a day, 365. Each one of those breaks is a disruption somewhere. Many of those disruptions involve indirect costs. So where do you think these 2 sentences fit on this ruler below? Does it represent reliability from the utility perspective or disruption from the city perspective? And in fact, you can take the numbers right from these 2 sentences and derive, it comes out to be 12 breaks per 100 miles of pipe per year. So they're doing great. We're doing great as a nation from that perspective. That's why planners need to develop their own perspective and their own way of viewing things. The water main break on the left is going to be resolved by direct costs. There's no property damage, and by the time the homeowner gets back, water will be restored, no problem. Water main break on the right, everybody in the city is going to know about it, and here's a repurposed fireman that is paid for by the public, not the utility. The shuttered businesses are loss of revenue that day. Employees are not making hourly wages. And if there's any damage in the businesses, you better have water main flood insurance, not just flood insurance, because water main flood insurance is different. And even a deductible is out of pocket. So we need to consider the scale of these disruptions a season. Is January worse than July? Frequency and location to start determining where disruptions are hazards. And the data exists to characterize the where and why a city chronic hazards are, or chronic disruptions are hazards. We just need a methodology. And so when you're talking about developing a methodology, of course, you have to go back to what is accepted, what's the accepted methodologies. And as I mentioned, this report card just came out last month, and they were able to take all infrastructure in the United States, from nuclear power plants to elementary schools, across 17 categories, and derive a single letter grade for the United States. So logically, if you can do that, it seems that you should be able to take some key intersections in your city and discuss them by providing a letter grade for that. Well, consider this image. There's 50,000 structurally deficient bridges in the US. This bridge is an F. Suppose it had been carrying a brand new PVC water main that had a grade of an A. Or this image, suppose you had just paved the road, and that's an A, and 7 feet below is a 130-year-old 48-inch diameter cast iron water main. That's an F. Taking just a simple GPA of these two images would say, hey, Los Angeles or whatever, you're doing great. It's average, it's something to consider, but it's average. Is that meaningful? Are these two images actually average? So the point is, grading requires grading at a sub-city level or sub-block level is what I'll talk about, requires the concepts of co-location of assets, not just GPA. So this one slide on WISRD. But basically what we're looking at is from PACER output for roads and sufficiency rating for bridges to actual life of the materials of each asset and compared to service life. We look at the co-location of how all the sectors are spatially distributed with each other. We can bring in the results of the hazard mitigation plan and generate a sub-block vulnerability analysis across the city. And this is sub-block, as I said. And characterization begins with this sub-block level base map of vulnerabilities. So, as I said, I just moved to Jacobs. This is not a client. This is just a Google image of a map of Cambridge. And allow me to just use basic PowerPoint rectangles to make a point here. But if you had a base map of infrastructure vulnerabilities across the city, and then you could bring in geospatial data, and these are just examples, primary employer use tax, look at key commuting corridors, areas of high sales tax, high density residential, commercial, industrial areas. And then as a planner, decide how are you going to make this discussion with the public about where disruptions are becoming hazards, and use stakeholder engagement tools such as geodesign, and then further refine it by bringing in demographics, historic and tourism districts, key public transit infrastructure, and even if you're a Vision Zero type of community, high accident intersections, and then move from the city to key intersections that we want to talk about in particular. They can be secondary and tertiary intersections as well, but just to make a point. So I'm going to conclude with just 2 slides, and I use the word complementary view quite a bit, so I'm not changing the ISO risk equation of asset threat vulnerability, but a complementary view might include looking at the indirect costs of failure and damage and the location of the asset, looking at the threats as chronic threat of inaccessibility of the horizontal distributed infrastructure paradigm, and vulnerabilities, looking at the actual service life, which is actual age and co-location. This could be done with existing data. You can remove threats with engineered solutions, anywhere from utilidors and trenchless technology, forever pavements. And this is where WISRD just fits in a piece of the puzzle. MVCs as most vulnerable cells, that's the sub-block level of vulnerabilities. So I'll conclude with this slide. Urban planners need key performance indicators for chronic hazards, need to consider indirect costs in the city and where to identify intersections and segments and to integrate into existing resiliency planning. WISRD provides a look at the service life exceedance of all infrastructure sectors by material type, looks at the hazards of co-location, can bring in external threats from the hazard mitigation plan, and generate a sub-block level citywide vulnerabilities map. And again, you need a solution. You can't just point at the problem and yell at it. At the end of the day, these are your capital investment projects that you need to champion. So how are you going to create disruption-free zones in the city? Using utilidors and tunnels, as I mentioned. If you have a utilidor and you don't have to cut open the soft pavement, now you can talk about forever pavements that don't have pothole issues. So with that, I'm going to stop it and turn it back.
Great. Let us dive into some Q&A. First of all, we are recording this. It will be available on our YouTube channel, and we will have copies of the slide deck available on our webcast webpage as well. there were a couple of those questions. So if everyone wants to turn those webcams back on and we can get going. Joe, I know you have to leave first, so I'm just going through and see if there's questions for you. This one says, and for Joe, your work has identified not only a need for the integration of climate adaptation plans with the CIP, but the integration of broader community planning, long-range planning with CIP. Is there one key thing that could be done to realize greater plan integration at a local or regional level?
That's a great question. We're doing some research on plan integration right now. Some of the stuff that we're finding is that constantly monitoring what a plan says, the policies and the actions that come out of that plan, and really being vigilant about making sure that those things don't openly conflict with each other and actively support the policies of those other local plans. So that requires a lot of, I think, local leadership from planning directors, city managers, local city councils and such. I know that that's challenging, but another thing on that list, and I can't just say one thing, obviously, making the active collaboration with other local departments. My son is screaming in the background if anybody can hear that. Making the active collaboration with other local departments and agencies happen. So if you had to pick one thing, I'd say actively monitoring and managing those existing plans through that collaboration with other agencies and departments at the local level. I'll definitely put a plug in for the Plan Integration for Resilience Scorecard from Jamie Masterson and Phil Burke. I think that that's great. Full disclosure, we're doing a research project with them right now, but it really advocates, I think, very strongly for that type of sustained collaboration, not just at the plan making time, but after the plan is done, with the awareness that there are many plans that are active at any one time, and then using that collaboration as a springboard for kind of spatially evaluating policies in given areas in a community. So hopefully that's a helpful answer. It's like 10 things. It's not one takeaway, but hopefully that's valuable for you.
And then Joe, we'll start with you, and then we can kind of go around the circle here. So we understand as planners the importance of integrating CIP, all of that. So how do we engage with our local leaders, with our decision makers, the folks that put our budgets, our community budgets together, and how do we raise the importance of this?
Yeah, it's a challenge, especially without any directives from others in positions of authority. So I will say that that's like a major barrier, and it's one that, well, you know, I've even struggled to like give a nice, hard, strong answer to. But if you do have a supportive planning director, a city manager who thinks that that work is important, then lobbying them for that increased level of collaboration you think is necessary to make sure that the plan isn't just like a thing that had high levels of collaboration, that you're all working together and then the plan is done and then it's either sitting on a shelf or as a file somewhere on your website that isn't referenced at all. So it's definitely a challenge, and I don't think that it's easy, but you know, I'd love to hear what others might have to say about that.
Rhonda, maybe you could go next and talk about how you were able to, how Florida planners and were able to convince leadership to pursue resilience planning. I mean, I guess perhaps in your case, it's sort of the elephant in the room. Like, there's no question that you would have to. I guess perhaps in some other areas where it's not so obvious, perhaps it, you know, it might be a little more difficult. But if you could speak a little bit to your process in working
Sure.
with elected officials. And
so when I came to the county 10 years ago, you know, there hadn't been any resilience planning done. And so we were kind of like everybody else. Everybody worked in their silos. Planners are here, engineers here, I'm over here. And there was no resilience plan. So there was no need to coordinate on resilience planning. But as we started to get, even during when we were developing our climate action plan, the Green Keys plan, you know, during that 2 years, we're doing all that modeling and developing our data. It was still pretty separate. You know, it was only when that plan was done, Hurricane Irma struck in 2017. You know, we've been getting hurricanes for a long time, but now, you know, when with these increased fall tides in the October, November, and you know, now the whole county is affected. And even in the employees would say they see all these neighborhoods now being affected. And they understand. Now we started all talking together because, you know, the roads people can't just elevate the roads without determining how it's going to affect people and whether the county can afford it. So we have to talk to our budget person and we have to talk to the planners because, like I said during my presentation, if we can't, you know, what are these policy decisions? Are we really going to fill in, you know, 75,000 backyards in Monroe County? Are we going to allow them to elevate their yards? Are we going to allow them to put seawalls everywhere? Are seawalls, you know, what is that going to do to the sensitive marine nature of the Keys, our island community? Like I said, we're in a national marine sanctuary. So all these decisions, and when you're talking about raising $2 billion for a county of 75,000, that's a lot of money. So I have to really give credit to our county administrator and our commissioners. Our county administrator is a big believer in resilience, Roman Gastesi, and he worked really closely with the commissioners and helped us get in front of them to show our commissioners how important it was. And now here, you know, 4 or 5 years later, we're a really tight-knit county where we really work together closely because we can't afford not to. There's no use of me planning for resilience projects if roads says there's no room to widen the roads to raise them, and there's no use them trying to raise the roads if there's no money to pay for them. So our budget director has to be involved, and if our commissioners aren't going to support any of those activities, they're just going to say, well, you know, we're not interested in that. You know, we're just going to sit here and not raise money or not raise taxes or not look for grants, and then it's not going to work. So it has to be an integrated approach. And I have to say, you know, we're hopefully trying to lead the nation because we are so vulnerable. We're one of the most vulnerable areas in the country. So we can't afford not to work together. We have to work like this every day. And even when we're doing our capital improvement budgeting process, they ask right on there, does this project, whether it's a facility, you know, does it plan for sea level rise? So we're now elevating all of our public infrastructure enough so that the bottom floor will not be touched by water in the next 50, 60 years. So, you know, our fire stations, our libraries, they're all elevated 4 or 5 feet now so that they're not going to get wet and so that we're spending our money properly and that we can be here a long time. So, you know, our buildings are getting there. We're already in them and now roads are next. But yeah, definitely work together very closely.
Mark, do you have anything to add?
Oh, okay. Well, I would switch out elevating roads with elevating horizontal distributive infrastructure because you know, you can't just raise a road without raising your distributive infrastructure. And then if you decide that it's a flooding hazard for your buried electric and you want to go above ground, now you have a wind hazard. So you have to talk about it, not just what it does to the residences and access, but in terms of this paradigm of horizontal distributive infrastructure.
You're absolutely right.
This question came in a few times, in particular for Florida. Would it be cheaper to move people out of the Keys instead of trying to upgrade all the infrastructure instead? You know, we had this conversation when it came to Katrina, and you know, why are we rebuilding in a bowl in New Orleans when this is just going to happen again? And to that, before you answer it, we had a webcast earlier this year. Let's see, I think it was January 29th, and it was called Resilience in Vulnerable Communities When Climate Change Forces Relocation. And it was a community in Louisiana and a community in Alaska that were basically forced into, not forced, I guess, but were given the option to relocate. And it was a really fascinating webcast about how that process worked of moving these vulnerable communities and what turned out to be low income and communities into a safer area. So I urge you to check that out. It was January 29th, and you can get to that video via our website, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. So Rhonda,
Sure.
should we just move everyone out of the Keys?
No, And I'll tell you, and it's not just me saying that. And yes, there are areas that are going to be, we're going to lose areas if they're real low population and they're also really low. You know, we're probably not going to spend tens of millions or hundreds of millions in those low populated areas that are also low lying. But I'll tell you what, the Army Corps of Engineers came to town 2 years ago, actually almost 3 now, and they did a study. They're doing a resilience, they're just wrapping it up. And they looked at that very question. And they said, you know, they looked at is, you know, they run through all their analysis and they said, should we be buying out people? Should we, you know, buying out the people, especially in the low-lying areas? And, you know, as at first when they went along, they came out, they had almost, I have to tell you, they had almost 10,000 acquisitions on the list. They said, oh, these are in the low-lying areas. It's going to be cheaper to buy them out rather than to do something else. But as that progressed over the next year and they ran all their business models and especially their cost benefit models, it changed. And it changed because of this, because the cost of real estate is so high in the Keys. It's not uncommon. I don't know what the average price of a house. It's probably getting close to $1 million right now. And that's not a mansion. That's, you know, trailers go for 600,000. So it's very expensive in the Keys. It's a very desirable place to live and people are going to want to live here. So we heard loud and clear from the public when, you know, the Army Corps proposed all these massive buyouts. And they were mandatory, not voluntary, because anything in the Army Corps right now is when you have acquisitions, it's mandatory. We heard loud and clear from the residents, they did not want that. They wanted to stay here. And so, you know, the Corps, as they went through and did more of their financial models and started costing it out, they said, hey, it's cheaper to elevate these houses rather than buying them out. So elevation might cost 100 or 200,000 versus $1 million or more to buy it out. And so they've now switched all of those acquisitions into elevations. And so we're looking at, you know, we heard from our residents too, they want to stay here and they can stay here for many of them. If we can elevate the roads, you know, we just spent $1 billion the last decade on brand new sewer system. You know, we got all on a new sewer system. So now we're looking at $2 billion for roads for the next 25 years. It's not impossible. We think we can do it. There's going to be a cost share between the federal government, state government, and local. But yeah, we think we're going to be able to, a large majority of the properties will still be here. Like maybe not all of them, but a large majority.
What about folks that want to do new development in the Keys? Are there rules? Are there,
oh yeah,
is it deterred? Can you, I know you mentioned that I think you're kind of built out at this point.
so yeah, we don't have that many permits left to go. I don't know how many, but it's not very many at all, maybe a couple thousand, but we're very close to our limit. And the reason we're limited for growth in the Keys is because of hurricanes. We have to be able to evacuate people safely. And that means there's a capacity in the Keys and we can only have so many. Otherwise, if you exceed that capacity, you can't get out safely. So we're very near that capacity. And so we have to look at that. That's also involved in the planning process. So no, there's not going to be a lot of future development in the Keys unless people start suing us. People, that's another thing we're looking at. People start suing us with all these vacant lots available. You know, we'll see what happens with all of that. But it's a process. Now, like when we do have hurricanes, we had Hurricane Irma, we did some state grants became available for those who have lost their homes. Some state grants became available. If you went through the process, you could, the state would buy out your home. And so we're going through that, but let me tell you, there's a lot of hurdles in that. It's very slow going. I think we're learning a lot of lessons along the way. So hopefully by the time the next hurricane hits, we'll be more ready. But definitely, you know, it's not the low-lying areas in the Keys. Every area in the Key is susceptible to hurricane damage, you know, and especially storm surge, because we're very small islands, and a storm surge 6-8 feet up to 10-12 feet, it wipes out houses. That's why you have to elevate them. Once they're elevated, you'll have a lot less damage. And so that's what we're looking at here. Army Corps is offering, you know, federal money to elevate thousands of homes, and you know, people can take advantage of that. Then the county can do our part by helping to raise the roads. We'll build long-term resilience. Like I said, it might not be everywhere. People might not want to, you know, elevate their homes, and some people don't. There's a lot of people that don't want to do anything because they don't want their taxes raised. But it's going to be a journey over the next decade to see where we end up in the Keys in terms of how many people stay here and our policies and our infrastructure projects.
Mark, what say you about this? Let's say that there's a community that you're consulting with and they want to know, should we continue with development? Should we have new development? What are the things that we should consider when, you know, we live in areas with great hazards like hurricanes?
Okay, well, I'm not going to tackle the hurricanes. That's for Rhonda. My point is that we are not considering aging infrastructure as a hazard. So it can be not just coastal cities but from Duluth, Dubuque, Los Angeles, Boston, all cities are facing aging infrastructure. We're not calling it a hazard. And so I'll give you an example. Los Angeles has 7,600 miles of water main, 90% of which equal or exceed the recommended service life. That's 6,800 miles of water main below the roads of Los Angeles that are at service life. So this is what I mean about perspective. Is that a red flag? Or is the Department of Water and Power on top of it? And according to their capital improvement plan, they have a plan for addressing things, but their perspective again is direct costs and not the indirect costs. And this is why I'm going to have to keep on emphasizing that aging infrastructure is a comeuppance that is becoming a chronic hazard that will become more and more in our nomenclature as we move along. And anytime a new community comes on the radar, I just do a Google search of water main breaks in that area, and without a doubt, there's articles about our infrastructure is crumbling and this type of thing. So it's not about like what is the next acute shock. It's about what is the chronic hazards that we become inured to, and we see the signs of and the expressions of every single day, but we don't have a verbiage for or perspective or methodology or language or indicators for discussing it. So that's why I'm pushing that. I might not have answered your question, but I'm trying to make sure that we discuss this as a hazard.
Well, absolutely. And I think, you know, when a new developer is coming in thinking about, you know, putting in a new development, can the current infrastructure even handle it when, you know, the rest of the community's infrastructure is crumbling and you're expecting, you know, that much more weight to be put on it?
So that part I should address.
That they should be thinking, what are the things that communities should be thinking about when they're already aware, you know, that their infrastructure is outdated and needs help?
So when the ERA money came out in 2008, 2009, the only criteria was really, is it shovel ready? There was not a methodology for cities to address chronic aging infrastructure as a package. So when new developments come in, can we suggest or mandate that all the utilities are put in a way that they're accessible? And then you get into the cost benefit ratio of utilidors. And as I mentioned, utilidors would allow accessibility of the buried infrastructure without having to cut open your pavement. Because now you talk about a foundation for smart development, because we can't put in our smart city sensors and technology on roads that we're cutting open 550 times a day. But now if you can design your roads that are free of potholes, now we can talk about the foundation for smart city and resilient growth. So there's a larger way of saying, hey, you need new infrastructure. It's more a way of, here's how you need to place infrastructure so it's accessible.
Thank you. Guess what? We've run out of time. There's still a ton of questions and they're really great too. So folks, I urge you to reach out directly to our panelists today, who I'm sure would be more than willing to answer your questions. Thank you, Rhonda and Mark, and I know Joe had to pop off, and Kelly from the Hazard Mitigation Division. Thank you for joining us today. This was great. A lot of information. I don't think we're done with this conversation. I think we need to have you guys come back on again soon so that we can continue on this great discussion. So thanks to all of you. Thanks, folks, for joining in. Remember to log your CM credits. We're recording this. It'll be up on our YouTube channel, and we'll have the slide deck available on our webcast webpage, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. So everyone, hey, have a great weekend, and we'll talk next time.
Christine.
Take care.
Thank you.
Bye, Rhonda.
Bye. Bye.